Russia and China are plotting this scary plan for the world. Russia-Chinese alliance. Double the risk or limited partnership? Do the Beijing-Moscow strategic partnerships boundaries exist? Is the United States and its allies opposed to the Russia-China partnership? Does Russia depend on China? If so, by how much? Welcome to the video for today. Click the like and subscribe buttons before watching the scary plan that China and Russia are hatching for the world. China and Russia are increasingly aligning with one another, but the problems they offer are, in essential ways, dissimilar, according to the United States 2022 National Security Strategy. The United States and Europe are not the only places on the globe where these difficulties are felt. However, it is all too rarely discussed when and how Beijing and Moscow coordinate or work together, as well as what this means for the United States and its partners or friends. According to some experts, China is a peer, not a rogue, and while Russia is a rogue, not a peer. Despite the fact that this elevation was established prior to Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But this act of aggression has only served to reinforce Western perceptions of Russia as a rogue nation. The connection between Beijing and Moscow is getting closer on the political, economic, and military fronts, but it is tilting more and more in China's favor. A cordial phone call between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin served as a fitting cap to the year in which relations between China and Russia improved on all fronts. Nevertheless, Moscow is losing strength, both absolute and relative, favoring Beijing more and more and casting doubt on potential future interactions. Despite the possibility of a future trust gap, the two sides are likely to keep deepening their military and political connections in 2023. Due to its disastrous invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become even more dependent on China. Russia is unquestionably the junior party in the partnership because its economy is only 1/10 the size of China's. This year's events have highlighted Russia's dependence. Bloomberg reported that Xi had asked Putin to postpone any further escalation in Ukraine until after the 2022 Beijing Olympics. If this claim is accurate, it might have profound effects on how Putin views China's place in the world, and how Russia conducts its foreign policy, and even how the war will turn out. Many observers at the time observed that this further delay would help Kiev by allowing it more time to accept aid and weapon shipments. The events seem to support the assertions made by the Western diplomat. In an apparent message to Beijing, Russia and Belarus launched joint training exercises called Allied Resolve 2022, which finished on February 20th, the day of the 2022 Beijing Olympics closing ceremony. Additionally, Putin started the invasion on February 24th, 4 days after the Olympics, which was arguably as soon as feasible but far enough away to allow for credible denial. The delay in the invasion may have had serious consequences. Russian forces just missed creating an air bridge to Kiev at the Battle of Antonov Airport in the early stages of the conflict. Was the battle's outcome determined by a growing delay, which was allegedly imposed by Beijing or imposed by Moscow to appease its ally? It appears that Russia's war actions were considerably and perhaps decisively impacted by its relationship with China. Delaying the invasion in accordance with Beijing's explicit or unspoken preference may have come at high cost due to the Russian military effort and even endangered it. Before the invasion, there was clear dependence on China, and it will probably get worse. In 2021, 4.4% of Russia's GDP was sent to China. This year, as the country's GDP declines and its commerce of the West shrinks, that percentage may easily reach 5%. Russia is unable to innovate independently and is excluded from Western technology markets. More than 30% of Russian IT professionals have left the country. The former CEO of Yandex, probably Russia's most successful tech business, currently resides in Israel. Russia will be obliged to look to China for semiconductors, 5G, and other technologies since it is unwilling to buy technology from the West and is unable to create them independently. The growing economic and technological sway of China in Russia will continue to limit Moscow's freedom. How much dependence can Russia hold? Moscow must continue to accept Beijing's priorities over its own, since Russian total national strength is quite likely to decline. Military ties between China and Russia are significantly and rapidly growing. China may have hindered Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but this year saw unparalleled military progress between the two nations. Late in November, in what appears to be a first for the two nations in the post-Cold War era, Chinese and Russia forces flew a joint bomber patrol and landed at each other's airfields. During the Quad Summit in May, China and Russia jointly flew bomber patrols. As long as Russia is involved in a military conflict with Ukraine, the two sides will likely continue to reject any kind of official military partnership. However, the military collaboration between the two sides is increasing, making it more difficult for the Quad and US allies, particularly Japan, to plan. Xi Jinping's erratic decision-making and relations with Russia, in addition to sanctions compliance, China's public health system was the most significant economic development in bilateral economic relations. Long after the world had closed, Beijing insisted on maintaining zero COVID, which limited its energy demand. Beijing's economy remained partially in lockdown in 2022, despite the widespread availability of efficient vaccines and a particularly contagious variety that necessitated movement restrictions and regular quarantines, including a devastating Shanghai lockdown. However, Xi's insistence on keeping lockdowns in place failed to stop the epidemic, and Beijing's failure to immunize China's senior population would result in hundreds of thousands of needless deaths. China's economic, social, and financial expenses increased during the lockdown without decreasing the overall death toll. And while the Chinese Communist Party pushes a narrative about the superiority of its employees, CCP officials, including Xi Jinping, may not all be that competent, or at least they're really not concerned with economic progress. In fact, Beijing's relaxed reaction to the costs of the invasion has been one of the most unexpected features of the China-Russian ties in 2022. The International Monetary Fund forecasts global annual GDP growth of 4.4% in January of 2022, before the war but after Omicron's emergence. The IMF now projects 2022 annual GDP growth will total just 3.2%. With much of that downturn occurring in Europe and North America, two of China's largest export markets. The impact of the war on China's economy is enormous but unknowable. According to a preliminary Barclays assessment, a global energy shock would result in about a 0.3 to 0.5% decline in China's GDP. The West has become concerned about Beijing's pro-Russia neutrality, which is perhaps the most significant factor. As a result, the United States, Europe, Japan, and other economies have tightened their restrictions on technology transfers to the PRC, limiting China's prospects for long-term growth. Despite the costs, Beijing has not attempted to persuade Putin to negotiate or even mediate a ceasefire. After the invasion, Beijing closely controlled the domestic media landscape to prevent any criticism of Russian forces, regardless of the fact that when they mostly complied with the sanctions and avoided attempting to quickly fill the void left by Western energy corporations. Because Chinese businesses continue to buy Russian energy exports and increase exports to Russia, Russian consumers are less impacted. Pro-Russian neutrality in China comes from the top down. While Xi and Putin have spoken at least 3 times on the phone and have met once since February 24th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has yet to get a call from his Chinese counterpart. The most damning fact is that Dmitry Medvedev, a former moderate Russian president who is now the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, was received by Xi at the same time that Zelensky paid his own unexpected visit to Washington. The fact that Xi chose to welcome Medvedev was very symbolic and shows that Beijing may be thinking about how to support Moscow without compromising its own interests rather than trying to put an end to the war. The convergence between Beijing and Moscow is real. Although to varying degrees and in different ways, both sides resent the constraints placed on them by Washington and Brussels-led international order. They are also harboring suspicions that the West is behind the pro-democracy movements and so-called color revolutions, and they have similar economic goals. The connection is still fragile. China will depend less on Russian political backing and military innovation if it keeps gaining power. The arrest of the Russian scientists working on submarine detection technology in the summer of 2020 was also made public by Russian counterintelligence officials. Both times, Russia's power vertical most certainly gave its approval for the disclosure of the material in these extremely sensitive circumstances. Even Vladimir Putin could be uncomfortable about Beijing's expanding influence and authority in Russia. The relationship is getting more and more unbalanced as China's economic and military capabilities are anticipated to increase in the years to come relative to Moscow's. Furthermore, China won't need a weak, untrustworthy partner as much if they can gradually stop importing Russian commodities like coal, gas, and oil. Moscow and Beijing are expected to get closer in 2023, but it's still unclear whether this partnership will last. Will China quit assisting Russia once it has greater economic and military power? Will they stay together for at least a decade, or will it soon come to an end? Comment below, and thank you!